They thought they had him. They believed Caesar was trapped, encircled, outnumbered, and finished. But what happened next would defy logic, reshape Roman warfare, and echo through military history for millennia. The Siege of Alesia was not just a battle. It was the moment Julius Caesar broke the rules of ancient warfare and gambled everything on a breathtaking plan. What unfolded in 52 BC stunned even his enemies and immortalized Caesar's brilliance forever. By the summer of 52 BC, Caesar's conquest of Gaul seemed nearly complete. Most major tribes had either submitted or been crushed. But Gallic resistance had not vanished. It had merely gone underground, waiting for a leader bold enough to challenge Rome's domination. That leader was Vercingetorix, a young Arvernian noble with charisma, strategy, and an unyielding will to resist. He forged what had long been thought impossible, a pan-Gallic coalition of tribes, unified not by ambition, but by desperation, determined to drive the Romans out of their lands. The revolt exploded across the Gallic countryside. Roman garrisons were attacked, allies of Caesar were overthrown, and supply lines were severed. The campaign became a war of attrition. Caesar, in his commentary, described it as one of the most critical moments of his career. His army, experienced, disciplined, and loyal, faced not only fierce opposition, but logistical nightmares. Yet Caesar did not retreat. Instead, he adapted. Vercingetorix understood that Rome could not be beaten in a conventional pitched battle. His strategy was to scorch the earth, to deny the Romans food, shelter, and rest. Towns and villages were burned rather than surrendered. Fields were razed. The Romans, who relied on foraging and local provisions, began to feel the strain. But Caesar's response was just as ruthless. He matched fire with steel, brutality with engineering, and uncertainty with resolve. After months of cat-and-mouse maneuvers, Vercingetorix retreated to the fortified hilltop town of Alesia, nestled between rivers and high slopes in what is now Burgundy, France. It was a natural fortress, surrounded by cliffs and defended by high walls, with thousands of Gallic warriors inside. There he hoped to wait out the Romans, confident that a relief army of Gallic reinforcements would soon arrive to crush Caesar's legions. To many, this seemed like the beginning of the end for Caesar. But Caesar, as ever, did the unexpected. Rather than storm Alesia and risk massive losses or retreat and appear weak, he ordered something almost unimaginable. He would build a wall, not around the fortress, but around his enemy. In just over 3 weeks, his men constructed a vast system of fortifications, stretching over 18 kilometers around Alesia. It was a marvel of Roman engineering: trenches, ditches, ramparts, wooden palisades, towers, and spiked obstacles. Every meter was designed to trap the Gauls inside. But Caesar didn't stop there. Knowing that reinforcements were coming, he built a second line of fortifications, another 21 kilometers facing outward, to defend against any Gallic attempt to break the siege. This double-wall strategy, known as circumvallation and contravallation, was unprecedented on such a scale. Caesar had effectively turned his army into a fortress, laying siege to a besieged city while preparing to be besieged himself. He had 60,000 men, most of whom were now tasked with defending 2 fronts, day and night. They had to endure hunger, constant raids, and psychological warfare. But they held. Inside Alesia, panic began to grow. As supplies dwindled and disease spread, Vercingetorix made a chilling decision. To conserve food, he expelled the town's non-combatants, women, children, and the elderly. These innocent civilians begged Caesar's lines for mercy, but Caesar gave no order to let them pass. Caught between walls, they starved in the open, a human tragedy that would haunt the memory of Alesia. It was cold, cruel, and strategically effective. When the relief force finally arrived, estimated at between 100,000 and 250,000 warriors from various Gallic tribes, the Romans were ready. The Gauls launched massive attacks on the outer wall. Inside, Vercingetorix's forces surged against the inner defenses. Caesar's men, now fighting a 2-front battle from behind their fortifications, displayed astonishing discipline. They fought in shifts, moved reinforcements where the fighting was fiercest, and used signal fires to coordinate. One night, the Gauls discovered a weak point and nearly breached the outer wall. Caesar, sensing the moment was critical, personally rode to the front lines, rallying his troops. In full armor, commanding from the front, he reminded his men that the fate of the campaign, and perhaps Rome itself, hung in the balance. What followed was chaos. Cavalry charges, desperate melees, and night battles fought under torchlight. The Gauls came close, terrifyingly close, but could not break the Roman lines. The fortifications held. Exhausted and demoralized, the Gallic relief force began to collapse. Without coordination, they withdrew, leaving Vercingetorix alone and surrounded. The next morning, silence reigned over Alesia. There was no final battle, no glorious last stand. Instead, Vercingetorix, dressed in his finest armor, mounted on his horse, rode out alone to surrender. In a moment forever captured in legend, he dismounted before Caesar, removed his sword and armor, and placed them at the Roman general's feet. The war was over. Or so it seemed. Alesia did not end Gallic resistance overnight. Some tribes continued to fight for years, but it broke their unity. It shattered their hope. Caesar's victory at Alesia was more than a military triumph. It was a psychological one. The message was clear. Resistance was futile. Rome would not be repelled, and Caesar would not be denied. The consequences were monumental. In the immediate aftermath, Caesar was hailed in Rome as a hero. Statues were erected. Triumphs were planned. But more importantly, his reputation as a military genius was now undeniable. He had defeated a force more than twice his size in enemy territory with limited supplies and by inventing a new form of warfare on the spot. Alesia became a blueprint. Military engineers studied its fortifications. Generals modeled their own sieges after it. Even centuries later, Napoleon would call Caesar one of the greatest tacticians in history, pointing to Alesia as the proof. For the Gauls, the defeat marked the end of independence. Roman rule expanded quickly. Roads, cities, taxes, and garrisons followed. Gaul was Romanized, its culture suppressed, its warriors absorbed into the empire. Vercingetorix was paraded in chains during Caesar's triumph in Rome, and later executed. His rebellion became a warning. And yet, in defeat, Vercingetorix achieved something remarkable. He became a symbol, a martyr, a figure who, though crushed by the Roman machine, stood tall against impossible odds. To this day, he remains a national hero in France, a reminder of resistance, courage, and unity. As for Caesar, Alesia was the climax of his Gallic campaigns, but it was also the turning point that catapulted him toward a far more dangerous path. With his enemies in the Senate growing jealous of his power and his legions fiercely loyal, Caesar would soon march on Rome itself. Civil war loomed. But none of that would have been possible without Alesia. It was here, on this battlefield, that Caesar sealed his legend, not just as a conqueror, but as a man who defied logic, commanded history, and bent the fate of nations to his will. Alesia was not just a siege, it was a gamble, a revolution, a warning, and in many ways the beginning of the end, for Gaul, for the Republic, and for the old ways of Rome.